Good morning, fellow truth seekers. Welcome back to Acts chapter 1, verses 13 to 26. Behavior that indicates what we believe, lesson 3. Now, today is supplemental material from lesson 3 that we really did not have time to deal with in class. If you remember, we ran into really two big questions about Judas. I gave you the short answer, but I promised you a more lengthy response, a more scripture-based response. This is that response. So the first question that we encountered as we worked through the text was, does the Bible teach that suicide is an unpardonable sin? I told you I do not believe that is so, and time permitting, I would bring scriptural evidence. The second question, and really more fundamental to Judas's situation, was Judas saved? Was he a believer? Was he born again? Again, I believe the short answer is no. And I gave you that short answer, but we really didn't have time to pull that apart. So that's what this video is about, is answering those two big questions. Now, as you think about this, the bigger question really, before we deal with suicide, is the question, was Judas a believer? And then we'll get into the question, is suicide an unpardonable sin? So let's start with that first question. Was Judas a believer? Was he saved? We looked at Acts chapter 1, and we saw the language there coming from verse 24 and 25, namely, and I'm giving you Bill Mount's translation first, you, Lord, who know the hearts of all, show which one of these two you have chosen to take over the place of apostolic ministry which Judas left to go to the place where he belongs. The ESV translated that Judas turned aside and went to his own place. But this brings me to point number 1. This language of his own place, or the place where he belongs, is not language that's consistent with heaven. This is not language that we find in the Bible, Old Testament or New Testament, that's consistent with someone who dies and goes to be in heaven. Rather, this language seems to point more to an afterlife under the judgment of God. So let's look at the Old Testament first and see the language there as Moses recorded it. Now, they wouldn't have understood the afterlife as clearly as we do today, but listen to the description. Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man full of years, and was gathered to his people. Well, being gathered to his people is much different than going to your own place or the place where you belong. We see this again with the next patriarch, Isaac. And Isaac breathed his last, and he died, and was gathered to his people, old and full of days, and his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. Again, the language coming out of the Old Testament, a person died, they were buried, but they personally, their spirit essence was gathered to their own people, other believers in Yahweh. And then the final patriarch, Jacob. When Jacob finished commanding his sons, he drew up his feet into the bed and breathed his last and was gathered to his people. So this language we find in Acts chapter 1 about Judas is not consistent with the afterlife as it's described in the Old Testament. That's point number 1. But equally continuing on that point, it's not consistent with the language we find in the New Testament. This is Paul writing to the church in Corinth. Yes, we are of good courage, and we would rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord. Here, the afterlife is described as being at home with Jesus. Or we can look to Philippians. For me to live is Christ, Paul said, and to die is gain. If I am to live in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me. Yet which I shall choose, I cannot tell. I am hard pressed between the two. My desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better. You see, the language of the New Testament about heaven is not your own place or a place where you belong or even a place which you deserve. It's rather to be with the Lord. It's that kind of place. So that brings me to the end of point number 1. Was Judas saved? No, I don't believe so. The language used in Acts chapter 1 is not consistent with the language of heaven. That brings me to point number 2. Point number 2, the Bible tells us plainly that Judas was not a believer. We see this in John chapter 6. A lengthy text, we'll read it. This is the bread that came down from heaven, not like the bread the fathers ate and died. Whoever feeds on this bread will live forever. Jesus said these things in the synagogue as he taught at Capernaum. When many of his disciples heard it, they said, "This is a hard saying. Who can listen to it?" But Jesus, knowing in himself that his disciples were grumbling about this, said to them, "Do you take offense at this? Then what if you were to see the Son of Man ascending to where he was before? It is the Spirit who gives life. The flesh is no help at all. The words that I have spoken to you are spirit and life, but there are some of you who do not believe. For Jesus knew from the beginning who those were who did not believe and who it was that would betray him. John 6:58 through 64. It seems to be saying, first, Jesus knew those who would betray him, and not only did he know that, or did not believe in him, but not only did he know those who did not believe in him, but he knew the one who did not believe in him and would be his ultimate betrayer. And so I would say, as you look at John 6, it seems to be implying that not only did Judas betray him, but he never believed on him in the first point. And so point number 2 of my points of why Judas was clearly not saved is the Bible tells us clearly, Jesus states that he was not a believer. That brings us to point number 3, what Jesus said about Judas as recorded in Matthew 26. When it was evening, he reclined at the table with the 12. So this is Jesus. And as they were eating, he said, "Truly I say to you, one of you will betray me." And they were very sorrowful and began to say to him, one after another, "Is it I, Lord?" He answered, "He who has dipped his hand in the dish with me will betray me. The Son of Man goes as it is written of him. But woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that man if he had not been born." Now we could simply stop right here. If words mean anything, Jesus has just said it would be better if the person who betrays him, which we know would be Judas, it'd been better if he had never been born. Now, Jesus, who knows the end from the beginning, Jesus, who knows the future, clearly says that what awaits Judas is something tragic, and it would have been better for Judas to have never been born. And so, again, I would argue that this is further evidence that Judas was not saved. Judas was not born again. And that's point number 3, is Jesus' statement about him, that it would have been better for him had he never been born. And that brings us to point number 4. Satan entered Judas at the Last Supper. He did not influence him. He possessed him. We read about this in John chapter 13. One of his disciples, whom Jesus loved, was reclining at the table at Jesus' side. So Simon Peter mentioned to him to ask Jesus of whom he was speaking. So that disciple, leaning back against Jesus, said to him, "Lord, who is it?" Jesus answered, "It is he to whom I will give this morsel of bread when I have dipped it." So when he had dipped the morsel, he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. Then after he had taken the morsel, Satan entered into him. Jesus said to him, "What you are going to do, do quickly." A believer can be influenced by Satan. He can be influenced by the demonic host, but he cannot be demon possessed. He cannot be possessed by Satan or any demon. All lines of evidence point to a conclusion that Jesus was never saved, that he was never born again. So point number 4 in my list of points, Satan entered Judas at the Last Supper and possessed him. That would not be possible if Judas had truly been a believer. And so one more, and this is my point number 5. This is what Jesus says concerning his disciples in John 17 when he prays over them. "And I am no longer in the world, but they are in the world, and I am coming to you, Holy Father. Keep them in your name, which you have given me, that they may be one, even as we are one. While I was with them, I kept them in your name, which you have given me. I have guarded them, and not one of them has been lost except the son of destruction, that the scriptures might be fulfilled." Jesus lost none except the son of perdition. And by the way, all of that fulfilled scriptures. I could have made another point or two. Go read Psalm 69 and go read Psalm 109, the Psalms that Peter uses to replace Judas. Clearly, in point number 5, though, what Jesus says about his disciples, in particular about Judas being the one who is lost, indicate that Judas was never a believer in the first place. And so hopefully that gives you scriptural evidence to why I believe Judas was never saved. The truth is, he never placed faith in Jesus Christ. He never repented of his sins. He was very sorry for his sin when he saw what played out with Jesus, because it didn't play out at all like he had thought when he betrayed him. But he never repented. being sorry for something you've done is much different than repenting. And we have no indication that Judas ever believed, and we have no indication that he ever truly repented of his sins. But that does bring us to the second question. Is suicide an unpardonable sin? What's funny is both of these questions had come up from the Truth Seekers classes prior to this lesson, so it was very interesting to see them converge during the lesson. Now, let me say a number of things before we get to this. Suicide is a horrific sin that leaves a wake of tragedy in those who are left behind. Suicide not only destroys the person's life, but it victimizes friends and family that are left behind. The Bible is not for suicide. The Bible is not pro-suicide. God is not pro-suicide. God is the author and controller of life. Each of us is here based on God's decision. To decide to take our own life is to attempt to take the place of God at that particular point. But, having said all that, we are never told that this, suicide, is the unpardonable sin. It would seem to me if there was something that we could do that would block our ever being saved, God would tell us that plainly. This is not an Easter egg hunt. God clearly tells us what we need to do to be saved. And if there was something we could do that would prevent that, I believe God would tell us that. Now, maybe you're thinking, well, this sounds like your opinion. Well, there are a few examples. Two come to mind in the Bible. We'll quickly look at one of them. This event occurs at the end of Samson's life. Samson is now a blind slave due to his own sin. The Philistines are making sport of him. And we read this beginning in Judges 16. Then Samson called to the Lord and said, O Lord God, please remember me, and please strengthen me only this once. O God, that I may be avenged on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. And Samson grasped the 2 middle pillars on which the house rested, and he leaned his weight against them, his right hand on one, his left hand on the other. And Samson said, let me die with the Philistines. Then he bowed with all his strength, and the house fell upon the lords and upon all the people who were in it. So the dead whom he killed at his death were more than those he killed during his life. So Samson gave his life in killing additional Philistines, more than he had killed in his life. But Samson, as you can see, took his own life in the process. This is suicide. It doesn't matter how you do it. This is an example of suicide. Now, amazingly enough, Samson shows up in a very special place in the New Testament. I don't know if you're thinking about it right now, but it's the Hall of Faith. It's Hebrews chapter 11. Now, as the writer is writing Hebrews, this is likely Paul, but we can't be positive, and he's wrapping up the Hall of Faith. He says this in verse 32. And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Samson, although in the end he took his own life, he committed suicide, he shows up here in the Hall of Faith. Gideon, Barak, Samson. Again, God is not for suicide. It is sin. It leaves destruction in its wake. But we have no indication that it's the unpardonable sin for Samson, who was a follower of Yahweh, although not a very good one, who ultimately took his own life at the end of his life, shows up in the Hall of Faith. Now, hopefully this provides additional scriptural evidence for my 2 short answers in class to those 2 important questions. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine upon you. Lord willing, I will see you this Sunday in class as we begin to crack open Acts chapter 2. God bless you.